Welcome to Uncommons. I'm Nate Erskine-Smith. Now, this is part 2 of a 2-part series we're doing on the Canadian immigration system, that question of sustainable and fair immigration. In part 1, I was joined by Professor Mikal Skuterud from the University of Waterloo. And in this episode, I am joined by the CEO of the Century Initiative, Lisa Lalande. You'll hear her talk about her previous background in affordable housing work. Well, she's now the CEO of an organization that's focused on growing the Canadian economy in a significant way by 2100, including by growing the population of Canada to this aspirational goal of 100 million people by the year 2100. And you'll hear her articulate why. You'll also hear her articulate this is not about unrestrained immigration, it is about smart and planned immigration. Now, Mikal, if you listen to our first episode, Professor Skuterud had some choice words for the Century Initiative. You'll hear Lisa Lalande dispute much of that line of attack. But at the end of the day, and I emphasize this in the first episode as well, there's a lot that these two parties agree on. They agree that temporary immigration needed to be curtailed, but they also agree that the permanent immigration levels have been overcorrected by this government in recent days. Lisa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot to talk about on the immigration file in recent days, for sure. But let's go back to basics for your organization. What is the Century Initiative and what are its goals?
Sure. So Century Initiative is a national nonpartisan charity. We were established in 2015, and we have an objective of inspiring the country to think bigger and bolder about our future. We set a North Star aspirational target of 100 million people in Canada by 2100. But I always say whenever I'm talking that that goal was meant to, spark debate, inspire discussion around what our future could look like and how do we need to work together across the provinces and across communities, right? Across the whole country of how do we need to work together to advance really, deep-rooted systemic change in order to have and continue to have a high quality of life and standard of living for all Canadians. So at the heart of our work is advancing population growth, but we don't want stupid growth. We want smart growth, smart, responsible growth. That means thinking about issues not just in the immediate term, but in sort of the medium, not the short term, but the medium to long term. So it's really about long-term thinking and planning. We've become known more for our work in immigration, but we actually have a much broader agenda. We try to look at issues that we face as a country, like housing, infrastructure, support for children and families, education, skills development, the economy, with immigration as one plank, as one pillar of our work. I think because it has become such a polarizing issue in the country, we've become sort of more known for that work, but our work is much, much more broader and deeper than that.
Why?
Yeah.
Can I ask though? So when we talk about the Century Initiative, we're looking at 2100 as the end date for some objectives. One of the objective, as you say, is 100 million Canadians. Why is that the magic number?
So, I've said this, and I've been on record saying this since I joined the organization in 2020. Whether we hit 100 million or 90 million or 80 million or 70 million by 2100, we will not see ourselves as having not been successful. The end objective is not the number; it's the ambition. As a nation, we need to think bigger. And we need to invest over the long term to tackle some of the most complex challenges that we're facing. We believed that, ambition requires a North Star objective. And so we were really hoping to rally Canadians around this big picture idea of what the country could be. I actually like to start, normally what I do when I start with talking about Century Initiative, I talk about why. Like, why were we formed? Because when you just think about the mission or the number, you can take a step back and say, well, like, what does that mean? And aren't we big enough already? And so essentially,
well, that's fair. So let's talk about that. But as we talk about that, we were talking before recording, and obviously this is part 2. The idea is this is part 2, and the first conversation was with Professor Skuterud. He was quite critical of the Century Initiative, and he the way he characterized it was this was founded by two of the wealthiest patrons or families in this country, and it was a pejorative sort of framing of it. Who are the people behind the centrifuge? You know, you can maybe talk about how you came to this, but who's brought this together, and what is the impetus of the organization overall?
So the organization, or the discussion around what Canada might need, and would there be a role for a charity like ours, to help sort of guide and inform, how we approach some of our challenges. So my understanding, because I joined the organization in 2020, the organization and the idea behind it started in sort of 2009, 2010, when a group of not just business leaders, but there were academics that were involved in the original sort of consultations, as well as policy leaders, thought leaders, nonprofit leaders, as well as prominent members of the business community, to say, okay, the country is facing some pretty significant demographic shifts. We have an aging population. We have a declining fertility rate. It was 1.33 in 2022. It's in 2023. It's now 1.26. It's the lowest level on record. We've now joined other developed nations with the lowest fertility rate. And so as we have, more people aging and retiring out, with fewer number of people coming in to work behind them, it forces us to sort of make a decision as a country, because it means that we won't have the tax base necessary to fund our social services, our educational system, our healthcare system. It impacts our economy. And if this sort of situation persists without any kind of intervention, if we just say, you know what, we're not going to come up with any kind of interventions to address our demographic shifts, we're going to be in a very difficult place in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We're going to decline as a nation, and we won't be able to advance our economic interests, our environmental interests, our humanitarian interests, we won't be able to advance or be influential on the global stage. And so as they looked at the issues, because the issues are very complex, as I said, immigration is just one plank of our work. The conversations around change and systems change is very nuanced. And so there was a discussion, and a decision made that we need an organization that's really challenging political leaders and challenging leaders right across the country to sort of say, how are we going to actually address the housing shortages that we have, the lack of investment, the lack of investment in infrastructure, the demographic shifts, our labor shortages. How do we see that as a system in order to position ourselves, best as we move forward? And there was no other organization like this in the country, and at the time, no other organization like this in the world. And so, Century Initiative was born with this desire to inspire a positive view of our future, and to convene and to advise on paths forward. And so, we have a number of people from all different walks of life on our board of directors now. I actually come from the nonprofit sector primarily. I spent a decade in affordable housing. I worked with the Mowat Center. I led their not-for-profit research hub. We looked at, over the 5 years I was there, we looked at sort of complex systems change. So how do we actually improve long-term social outcomes for Canadians? And the board chose me as the CEO in 2020 because they knew that, based on the work we did at the Mowat Center and my practical experience in the field, that I could make a difference in terms of trying to advance a very, very complex agenda. So I find the arguments,
Can we break apart? Let's break apart the complexity to some extent, because you said a few things there that I think are. There's no single objective in what you were articulating there. Insofar as one of the objectives is around the dependency ratio, and we have an aging population, and obviously the aging population, there are two consequences to that. We are spending a great deal. You look at, we were just going through this old age security debate in Parliament right now, but we're spending $80 billion this year on old age security, and that's going to increase to $100 billion in just 4 years' time. And there are costs obviously associated with making sure that seniors rightly live in dignity, but there's also a increasingly smaller working age population in terms of a tax base to sustain that. And so the dependency ratio is a challenge. But you also talked about sort of standing and clout, I suppose, on the world stage, which is a different goal altogether. If we're growing to 100 million people and we're going to be more, playing a role in keeping with the United Kingdom or another country with a population of a much larger size. Uh, those are two very different objectives, but that you're ultimately trying to get towards the same ends, I suppose. How do you see the importance of those different objectives, and how do you manage conflicts as between them potentially?
Well, I see them as linked. I see them as they're intimately connected. In that, if we have a strong economy, we're going to have a stronger voice on the world stage, and we're going to be in a better position to advance our interests than, smaller countries, smaller population, and smaller economies. And so, I think particularly as the world is changing at a rapid pace, and the U.S.-led democracy is not necessarily guaranteed. We need to really think differently about how, where we want to be 20 or 30 years from now, and how strong we will, and what kind of position we will be in, how strong we will be to be able to advance our interests. And so I see them as connected. And so the question then becomes, like, how do you advance this kind of complex agenda? And that's where I say to the professor, I think simply, discounting our work because of two people that were involved in the early days of Century Initiative is lazy, to be frank. And it's frustrating because as an organization and as a country right now, we need positive leadership. We need people who are looking for common ground. And we actually probably have a lot of similarities in terms of our views and opinions than he may potentially realize, in that when we think about immigration, we actually do not believe that the economics should be the only metric we use to inform our immigration policy. Our immigration system is not simply based on economics. We have family reunification objectives. We have humanitarian objectives, and to sort of rest our country's economic ambitions, and specifically GDP per capita on our permanent migration economic stream, which has now declined in terms of the targets we've assigned, is kind of silly. And so when we think about how do we strengthen our economy, immigration is certainly a factor, but it's not the only driver. And so we really need
but on that, it's useful. So there are many objectives we could potentially have with immigration, of course. And so I don't think many Canadians would think about immigration driving our standing on the world stage, potentially as a lot of Canadians want our country to play a strong role on the world stage.
Nor do we say that either. We don't say that immigration will do that. We say a strong nation, a strong economy,
right?
A bigger country that has a strong and healthy economy is in a position to do that.
I understand, but in that case, I understand. But in that case, GDP, the total size of the economy does matter, and that's driven in part by immigration. And look, I push back with Professor Skuterud on the dependency ratio because I do think there are good arguments there, and I want to get into some of them. But on the question of GDP per capita, because I think let's bracket out. There are many good reasons to have humanitarian immigration inflows. There's obviously good reason to have family reunification inflows. Those are all, there's no maybe optimal number per se, but we can push and pull to say we should do more, or people think we should do less. But those who think we should play a stronger role on the fairness question, humanitarian question, we should pursue that and we should debate that and we should try and win that fight. But on the pure economics of it, he would say it's not about GDP overall. Like he would throw up his hands and he would say, well, why do we care about GDP growth in sum? It's the right metric, the right goal we should be shooting for is GDP per capita. And the economics of immigration in this country are not fit for purpose to get us to GDP per capita and increase GDP per capita.
Well, I go back to I have a couple of points, and I don't want to go too down the rabbit hole. I'm trying to debate.
We're here for the rabbit hole.
But I mean, I also hear about, GDP per capita being equated to improving equality and addressing inequality. And, GDP per capita only measures economic output, not the distribution. And it doesn't measure inequality. So there are other better measures if you're going to, try to make the argument that GDP per capita is about improving, equality for all Canadians. Maybe the Gini coefficient might be better. But my point, whenever I talk and whenever I'm debating economists, is to say that I don't think economists should be the lead voice on immigration policy, because we should have other metrics that tell us how immigration is impacting prosperity. One, because we have different objectives that go beyond immigration for our that go beyond economics when it relates to immigration.
That's point well taken on the point well taken on humanitarian and family reunification and the non-economic class.
Right, but I also wanted to say that there are other benefits to immigration that I think are important, and that I think if we presented them to Canadians, I think they would probably say they're important as well when determining how we use that information to determine immigration levels and who comes to the country. So an example could be that we know that immigrants donate more to charity. They volunteer more than Canadian-born. We know that whether a child or a grandchild of immigrants, whatever class they come through, whether it's economic or family or refugee, that their outcomes they tend to be stronger than their predecessors. And we also know that studies of immigration don't look at the significant economic impact of unfilled jobs and skilled shortages that would arise in some sectors if we really significantly pull back as we have in immigration. So I think, what we say and what my position is, having looked at this for quite a while, is that economics tend to use very narrow measures. So wages, impact on public finances, GDP per capita. And those are way too narrow that if we really want to understand, the real question to us is like, how is immigration truly impacting prosperity? And how is it impacting prosperity over the medium to long term? Because most of the studies and most of the data they're pointing to look at the short to medium term. And where the benefits of immigration typically happen over the medium to long term. And so the question then is, what should those measures be? And then what's the time frame that we should be looking at those measures?
Let's pause there, because that's actually very useful. Because I did push back. I still struggle with if GDP per capita is your be all end all when it comes to economic class migration. Yeah. The challenge is that there are, and I use this as an example. I'll throw it to you as well. But a friend calls it the Ohtani effect. It's like, Shohei Ohtani comes into this country, $70 million a year. He individually lifts up GDP per capita versus 1,500 PSWs who are going to increase the well-being of people given the healthcare challenges we've got. They're going to increase the well-being of people overall. And while it might drag GDP per capita in the short term, they are going to be coming from the pre-existing population is better off on a wellness basis. And the population that's coming, those 1,500 PSWs, are also improving their lot in life being in Canada. I mean, one assumes, given the migration choice that is happening, they're improving their lot in life as well. Although potentially that's contestable, I don't know. So GDP per capita isn't capturing that overall benefit to all parties there. And he responds to say, well, it's going to have additional challenges to inequality, and shouldn't we be capturing them in the total group, and it's not right to exclude them. And he's got a challenge back, but it still means that maybe GDP per capita is not the appropriate measure overall, as you say, because it's a short-term metric, and it doesn't really account for all of the impacts upon our well-being. You're saying prosperity, but in that example, well-being for sure. Yeah. But what then are there was an article in the Globe, I think Tony Keller had, that we got a moneyball immigration. Yeah. I like the idea of moneyballing things. So what are the right metrics? Because I think that is the Skuterud challenge, which is a fair one, which is, I'm bought in on, which is, if you're going to direct policies or shift policies in a particular direction, what's the goal? And you got to set end goals and metrics for yourself to judge success.
So, I mean, ultimately, when you're doing it properly, like any good logic model, you're actually determining your indicators, your outcome metrics based on your objectives. And that's why I push back on, like, are we redefining what our objectives are with our immigration system, or are we just trying to determine the metrics? But that's, again, another rabbit hole piece. There's a couple of things I wanted to respond to on GDP per capita. The
Yeah, for
first,
sure.
and I know what economists say because they always push back on this with me, um, but we know that immigrants have a difficult time, particularly skilled immigrants, when they come here in terms of having their credentials recognized, and that there have been studies that show that if they can get here and move more quickly into the fields that they've studied into work and get their credentials recognized, it can actually boost GDP per capita. Now, what I've heard economists say is, well, we know this already and we haven't been able to figure that out. So, and then I'm like, so what? Like, so your answer is we just don't bring people then? Or do we fix the problem that's preventing us from actually, being able to allow people to come and work in their fields and then ultimately contribute more to GDP per capita? So that's to me, I think we should actually try to fix that issue here in order, because that could actually boost GDP per capita. That's one. The second piece is I think this is where, when I talk about broadening the measures, and this is where I think economists are used to being in the classroom a lot and not necessarily in the field, because an engineer, a tech entrepreneur, we definitely need. But if you're talking about a community like Kirkland Lake, Ontario, or Vernon, BC, they might need personal support workers. They might need nurse practitioners. They might need nurses. They also need doctors. And shouldn't the communities inform who they need in their communities to contribute to a stronger, healthy community and overall quality of life and well-being in those communities? Why should it be an economist out of Southwestern Ontario pushing a specific economic metric when there are other factors? So if you think about going back to the question of what is the objective of our immigration system, it should be also regionalization. And we don't want to just necessarily build up, Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, our biggest cities. We want to empower and strengthen all communities across the country. But the communities themselves know what they need. And there's been a lot of talk about, obviously, permanent migration and temporary migration. A lot of Canadians don't know the differences between the two. It's complex. And Century Initiative, we've been on record for a while saying that we need massive reforms in temporary migration. In that way, there was no plan. There were decisions made, whack-a-mole approach to policy that created a lot of problems. And I wrote a paper like 2 years ago talking about, like, hey guys, I'm waving the flag. Like, if we don't, get our stuff together, we will actually be in a position where it's going to impact public opinion on immigration. And I was right. But permanent migration, there's been a lot of really, really great work in permanent migration, and that gets lost in the messages, particularly from some of the economists who are critical of immigration policy right now. For example, the provincial nominee programs, the other pilots that were in play, the agricultural pilots, those are unique programs to Canada, and they put power in the hands of local communities, of the provinces, to inform the immigration process. And they also have mechanisms in place where they connect employers, but also the community organizations to people coming in, immigrants coming into the community, which can actually improve social integration, social cohesion, and cultural integration, which I think is going to be the biggest issue that any developed nation, it is an issue, but it's going to become more of an issue in the coming years. And so I think the federal government should be really proud of those programs. And in fact, I was in Australia talking about them, and other countries are looking to those programs to say, what can we learn and adopt from those programs in our local contexts? So I think that there's the conversation has been, in my view, kind of taken over by economists, solely focused on very narrow economic measures. And I think that's influenced the public narrative right now, because now it's sort of resulted in a binary argument of immigration's either good and you're for it, or it's really bad and it's causing all of our problems, which is really...
Well, it's interesting because Yeah, but it's interesting because while there's obvious disagreement as between yourself and in this case Professor Skuterud, but you're referencing economists more broadly.
Yeah.
In my conversation with him and now my conversation with you, it seems like there's obviously market differences in what are our end goals and how are we going to measure success, but on the practicalities of today,
Yeah.
I think you'd both agree that you do both agree by the sounds of it, by everything you've articulated, that temporary immigration became unsustainable and needed to be curtailed and had become a real challenge and a problem.
100%.
And specifically, international students and the temporary foreign worker program, which is how I first came to Professor Skuterud, because I thought he was writing incredibly good stuff criticizing the temporary foreign worker program as we were in the process of expanding it, in April of 2022, which I thought was a problem. And then asylum seekers, which is not an easy challenge to confront. We have humanitarian obligations, but there's work to be done there to make sure that it's more sustainable than it has been, especially in certain urban centers. And so you got your temporary immigration that's blown up and caused all sorts of stresses and challenges. But you would both agree, interesting, I don't know if you know this, you would both agree that the government has overcorrected and reducing permanent immigration levels. So it sounds like on the practicalities of the day, you're on the same page.
Right. Well, that's what I was trying. That's why I laugh, because I think he has this perception of us as being this weird, like, conspiracy. He's got, I don't know. We are, I think, more in alignment. Like Century Initiative, just for the record, we have never, ever advocated for mass, unplanned growth in migration. We've advocated for smart, responsible growth with interventions across housing, infrastructure, supports for children and families. We were really strong in advocating for a national childcare plan for the country. And we're starting to get into more of the housing policy areas. We actually spent most of our time, and particularly when I joined, on looking at and advising on very specific targets for permanent migration. And we actually just sort of, talked about temporary migration as it should be part of a multi-year plan. We should be thinking about its connection to these other areas. And I think that the government kind of responded to various different groups when it came to temporary migration, including the fact that the provinces, so just to connect it to international students, there's this, just changing the number is not going to solve the problem that's facing sort of the post-secondary institutions. We have a funding issue, and the universities decided that it was going to deal with that by bringing in more international students, and the federal government said, great, fine. But without the funding that's coming in from those international students, a lot of these organizations are going to be facing some pretty significant challenges, and there's going to be impact to Canadian residents, no doubt, because it's going to mean like domestic tuition will have to go up, or they'll have to make significant changes to the quality of education. And I wish that post-secondary...
Or maybe instead of sending $3 billion in completely untargeted checks to Ontarians, they could invest directly in post-secondary education because it sets our economy up for success. I don't know.
Well, it calls for a bigger conversation in the country of like, what, as Canadians, what do we want our post-secondary education to look like, and how affordable do we want it to be for our children? I
think very affordable is what we want, but I think we also want governments to invest in it so that there's a high quality at the same time, and we don't basically balance our books on the backs of international students, which is obviously what we've been doing for going on a decade. But on the question of sustainability, because you said that you wrote something 2 years ago, you were waving the red flag. I think we landed on two ways of thinking about sustainability in my conversation with the professor, which is, on the one hand, this was his sort of way of framing it. It was, we need to make sure that the temporary immigration levels don't run away so far beyond our permanent levels that you can't actually take in, because it's a two-step immigration pathway that we've created in many cases, including for international students. But if you blow the international student population up, and you have an increase, but a smaller increase in permanent levels, you're never going to be able to two-step enough people in, and you've broken the sustainability of that two-step system. And then I added, and I think and we agreed that the second way to think about sustainability is the ability of the province, the city, the country to absorb those residents as it relates to housing, infrastructure, healthcare services, and social services more broadly.
Yeah.
And we clearly, and I don't think, we debated this a little bit in the last in part one of all this, but I don't think one level of government's to blame here. I think, both the feds, mostly the province, but the feds share some blame in the international student question. The feds have sole responsibility and blame, I think, in leaning on the business community or listening to, the calls from the business community for sort of unchecked temporary foreign worker growth, especially in the low wage category. And then I actually don't pin a lot of blame on anyone for asylum seeker growth, but there's, feds have to take that seriously, even though it's just a practical challenge as we see conflicts and problems around the world and increased migration overall. But
Right.
but when you were waving the red flag, so I guess before we get to your prescriptions and where if you think the government's landed in the right place on temporary, would you have anything to add, or do you think those are the two ways to think about sustainability as well?
So I would say 100% that we need temporary migration has to have a plan. And it has to be done in connection to the permanent migration level planning with extensive community consultation. And it has to be immigration policy, whether it's temporary or permanent, has to be seen in its connection to other policy areas, which is asking a lot for any government because it's saying, particularly in a federation, that we need horizontal planning across these different groups because we can't have, growth in numbers without having the corresponding investments to ensure that we can accommodate that growth well so that everyone benefits. And I think that message gets lost for whatever reason, because I think economists like the professor tend to focus on our, who initially founded us in 2015, rather than what we're actually trying to call for. We want, great minds like the professors, because I think that there's a lot of, some of what he says makes sense in terms of the economic metrics, but we need to me, it's not seeing the forest through the trees. That what we want and what Canada needs is it's a national framework for smart growth. So other countries have been developing these, so this is not new. And there's a lot of information that we can and learning that we can draw from. Provinces in the country have developed some, like PEI, New Brunswick. Japan is one, Australia is one, and there are common goals associated with these frameworks, and as well as sort of principles of what is required to advance a framework. So it thinks about, as we think about natural growth, as we think about immigration, how does it impact, what kind of housing investments do we need? What kind of infrastructure investments? And so to put it more practically, like, how is it connected to our libraries, to our healthcare systems, to our schools, to our parks? The things that actually.
But by the way, that's another area of, I think, agreement. That question of sustainability. So I think it's interesting hearing the different perspectives and how there's much more overlap in some ways, at least. Not obviously not all the way down as far as it goes, but there's more agreement. And then so when we look at the brass tacks of the government's plan and how they've responded, let's start with temporary immigration.
Yeah.
They've a number of measures, first slashing international students, then reducing it by a further 10%, changing rules around the ability to get postgraduate work permits, especially as it relates to, degrees out of colleges, 2-year degrees out of colleges, 3-year degrees out of colleges. There's changes, probably not, I don't know if you would say it's sufficient changes on the temporary foreign worker low growth category. There's some changes, I think, iterative changes, I would say, on the asylum seeker question, although I don't think anything is fully, it's hard to fully address that. But when you look at the changes that you've seen so far on temporary immigration, and given you were waving the red flag 2 years ago, have we gone far enough on temporary immigration?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me a different question. But, no, I think that we can do more. I think, so I was pleased to see some of the reforms. I just think that they were done in a way that was sort of abrupt. It's a whack-a-mole approach to policy making. I think it sends. We were expecting sort of significant cuts in temporary migration, which again we actually said we need to be thinking more strategically about temporary migration, not just sort of boosting numbers without any kind of plan. But we were incredibly disappointed with the short-sightedness of the changes to the permanent resident categories.
Yeah, I want to get to that was my next question, because I was curious, is there more to do temporary? You're saying yes, there is. And we can maybe get into some of the details.
Yeah. But what they've done is some of it's really good. Like, it was about time. But I think again, it's like way too quick without any kind of plan. So like
Gotcha. So the right direction and needed to happen, overdue, but massively abrupt. And then on the permanent levels, and this seemed to me, but I don't have the same expertise, but this seemed to me to be a political driven like the temporary immigration needed to be corrected on the numbers and the math of it and the sustainability of it all. I never saw permanent levels as being necessarily unsustainable. I think it was important that we're bringing in 80,000 in the humanitarian class. There's family reunification. Overwhelmingly, the bulk of it, 60%, is still economic class, which is contributing in different ways to our economy or to well-being. And maybe we could do a better job of targeting the right people. I don't know, but slashing those numbers also in an abrupt way seemed to me to be an overcorrection driven by politics.
I think I came out pretty quickly, and I've got a piece coming out in the Toronto Star tomorrow. In our view, it was, to be frank, it was dumb. It was short-sighted. It was politically motivated, in my view, and it's going to cause more problems for Canada in the long term than I think Canadians actually realize. I think what's unfortunate with some of the strong and effective advocacy from critics, particularly the economists and critics of immigration policy, is that the issues with temporary migration became intertwined and seen as the same as permanent. People weren't able to kind of see them as separate because most Canadians don't know the differences between temporary and permanent. And so,
but despite the economist view, is that the economist view, like if anyone who listens to the conversation that I had with Mikal, like he's clearly differentiating, and he's saying they had to take measures on temporary, and he was obviously excessively critical of the temporary foreign worker program, and I think rightly so.
What I've seen, sorry for interrupting, but what I've seen, and particularly in the last 6 months, is this constant pounding in, on social media and in traditional media. The numbers are out of control. The system is out of control. Well, then, if that's the case, the system includes permanent migration. So we can't be surprised, I guess, that they've done this. But it's just, if we think, and my message to Canadians is, if it's hard for you outside of Toronto to find a doctor now, it's going to be a hell of a lot harder in the next couple of years, because the permanent resident categories, they don't go down and back up. They go down, 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 and there's no plan. There's no national framework for growth that actually that's been presented alongside those changes that actually suggests we're going to be in any different place than we are right now, because the issues around housing, the issues around healthcare, and the issues around infrastructure investment were not caused by immigration or immigrants, or necessarily the population growth. They were exacerbated by it, and that the root causes of these issues have not been addressed. And so, our aging population is getting older, and we have more and more people retiring. And so we're going to have increased labor shortages. Like, there needs to be a plan, and there needs to be an urgency around that plan. And then the question becomes, where does the temporary migration piece fit in? And what are the measures that we should be using? And I argue it shouldn't just be one economic metric. It needs to be broader in connection to our overall objectives around not just immigration, but who we are as a country. I believe that our immigration system should serve our national interests, not necessarily just economic. And so I think that, and Canadians need to be the ones that determine, once we've identified through collective effort what those sort of metrics should be, then they can decide for themselves, what kind of immigration system they actually need. I just think there's not enough information, and that there's no plan. And that's what really concerns us. Century Initiative has always been about.
It's interesting. Yeah. And it's interesting what you say, because there are decisions being made that have consequences to what one might imagine Canada's role to be, but we're not really having that debate. So, for example, I was bugging Mark Miller yesterday to say, I think this is an overcorrection, and we were going back and forth on it. And my argument is we're going to see now massive backlogs. We already have backlogs. Those backlogs are only going to get much worse. We're going to see processing just completely broken, and we're going to see many people overstaying, and we're going to have to confront that challenge. And then on top of that, our humanitarian numbers, and people can debate what the number should be, but we've made an active decision, whether people even knew it or not, to massively reduce those humanitarian numbers on the backs of a conversation that was really about temporary immigration.
Right. And do Canadians actually want that if they were actually asked that? I don't think so. The other piece you haven't mentioned yet, I know it's probably in there, is that we can't forget that we are in a global war for talent. People, especially when we're talking about the economic migration, that we're saying we should measure and change our whole system to only be about GDP per capita. We're in competition with the UK, the US, Australia, like other countries want the best of the best in the world. And people have a choice in these cases on where they go. And, these sudden shifts send a message to the world that we're becoming more protectionist. We're closing our doors. We might not, could you bring your family if you come? Like, are there going to be backlogs and it will take a long time for your family to come? Because we've reduced the numbers for family sponsorship as well. Like, how does it fit in? And you know what? The tax environment may not be as favorable as other places. So you know what? I'm going to go to the US. And so we may be shooting ourselves in the foot here without maybe fully realizing it, because we're looking at it, and this is where we go back to the global piece. We're looking at this from a very internal Canadian lens, but we have a place in the world, and we want, and we have to remember that our immigration system should be designed to be able to attract those people and also retain them once they're here, because there's a retention piece too. So will all of these things mean that the people that we want to stay are going to leave? I don't know.
Yeah, I remember before I was elected, I think I was running in the nomination back in 2013, 2014. And I was I sat in having coffee with young Bengali professionals who had come to this country to contribute. And I represent a fairly large Bangladeshi community. And I remember their top line challenge was, right now, processing times were 2 years for them to be reunited with their spouse. And my response was like, "Oh, my wife would kill me." You know what I mean? Like I could not do that in the same way. And so you're asking a lot of people, especially to your point on the attracting the best and brightest. If your processing times are broken, I think you're right. There's a symbolic sort of signal in some ways if you're reducing the numbers, but there's just the practicality of, if you're killing your processing times, if you are not enabling the same number of people to come in for family reunification purposes, for example, that's going to have knock-on consequences to attracting the best and the brightest. And really, if there's the other considerations too on attracting best and brightest that we should be really focused on, which we are in some ways absolving provinces from not building the housing infrastructure that needs to be built, because frankly, like if you're attracting the best and the brightest, cost matters too, and if their quality of life is going to be impacted by the high cost of living and the high cost of housing, for example, that's a deterrent as well.
Yeah. I mean, no doubt, whoever is in government at any time in this country, this file is really complex, and the issues are complex given we're in a federation, because the solutions that we're proposing, they require all levels of government to work together, and it requires a horizontal planning.
It's always the Canadian challenge. Yeah.
Right. It's always the Canadian. I know that's not new, but and so that's why I say, like, I just wish, like, what's been troubling to me over the last couple of years in this role is that the conversation has shifted to, like I said, very binary. It's either good or bad. If you're wanting to change the levels, you're automatically tagged as a racist or anti-immigrant. Or you're for, and then it's sort of like this, conversation that's up in the air, not necessarily supported by by the right metrics to fully inform the conversation or the decisions, and it's very negative. And I think what the country needs, we need positive forward vision of what the country can be, should be, and we need people to rally everyone together to make that work. Maybe it sounds Pollyannish, but I don't think we're going to get ourselves out of the problems that we're finding ourselves with without that sort of positive forward-looking view. And I think in this case, when we think about immigration, I always try to push back consistently to say, we need a plan. We need a long-term plan for growth, recognizing that immigration is one factor in it. And until we see how it connects to these other policy areas, we're never going to get ourselves out of this position that we're in. And in fact, it may get worse. So, you talked about like, what should those indicators be then? And maybe another way of thinking about it is, asking the question of, well, how does immigration impact affordable housing in Canada? How does it impact, what kind of immigration do we need to not only bring and retain, to accelerate construction in the country? How should we be thinking about immigration, the levels planning, and infrastructure investments to deal with climate migration that will likely come to Canada in the next 20, 30, 40 years? Because these conversations that we're having now, we may not be in a position to be able to have them because, another thing that I don't often bring up, but because we're in this kind of podcast, we're in a country where we have, we've got the North and we've got our American cousins in the South. We're not subject to the same sort of mass increases in migration that other countries experience. And so we're in this incredibly, unique position to be able to have these kind of conversations, to design our immigration system in the way that works best for our national interests. But, we may not be in a position in the next 30, 40, 50 years to do that. And then what role should we be playing on a global stage in order to be able to accommodate people who need to be accommodated, given sort of places in the world will be uninhabitable? I know it's not as people aren't thinking about that right now, but it is something that's a long-term issue that we're going to.
Well, look. So here's my view of the politics of all this, and I'd be interested in how you see it. So,
yeah,
I think at a high level, everyone, a large majority of people will agree that immigration is beneficial, but immigration has to be sustainable and it has to be fair. And what does it, and so that's at a high level, and then you get into, okay, so, and these are more contested ideas. So what should the levels be for humanitarian classes? I mean, you're articulating that there will be an increased demand. Well, there's already a massive demand, but I agree, there will be increased demand. So when I think of Canada's role on the world stage, I want Canada to play a significant role in being the welcoming country that we can and should be, that we have been. I think those are, in my 9 years in politics, those are some of the most powerful stories I have heard, whether it's refugees from Syria, refugees from Burundi. I mean, these are incredible stories of people who have overcome adversity, and they're incredible contributors to our country today. And we shouldn't lose sight of that humanitarian obligation through immigration. You've got family reunification, which is also, a fairness question in many cases, but it encompasses both fairness and also economic considerations when you're talking about attracting the best and brightest. And then you do have overwhelmingly this economic class, historically, say over 50%, but I think for the last number of years, 60% of our total immigration is economic. And there, I think we do have to do a better job of understanding what the goals are, because, if it's GDP per capita, great. If it's about addressing the dependence ratio, great. If it's what are the goals and how are we managing towards these goals? If you're going to moneyball anything, you're going to completely fall flat on your face if you can't figure out what the goals are within that economic class and be very, very focused on that. And then I don't know about clout on the world stage as far I've never really thought about that as relevant to immigration policy per se, or total numbers of Canadians, but I don't think it's overly complicated in terms of the and then people will fight about I think we should bring in more doctors, or I think we should bring in more PSWs, or no, I think it should just be the point system, which is sort of the debate that I was having with the professor. But that's all within the economic class side of things, that's the sort of the playing ground, and then temporary foreign workers and the temporary levels, like that fits into the sustainability question,
Right.
as to are we able to accept this number of people to are our resources and are the permanent levels able to absorb them? Like it has to. That gets back to the sustainability question. But
Right.
it feels a little bit like I guess you put it this way, like there hasn't. We're doing things abruptly. We are changing course quickly. There hasn't been maybe the plan that there should have been, because at the end of the day, where you and the professor really agree on, any expert I think in this space agrees on, there needs to be a sense of stability to the system.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually refer to it as it's a whack-a-mole approach to policymaking, which is, and that's why I say that this was obviously in response to, a potential coming election. And it's just that Canada has some pretty significant challenges ahead, and we need leadership that thinks about things in more of the long term. Going back to, we've never sort of connected immigration to global influence. We've connected economic size and might to global influence. I think if you're thinking about immigration, there's benefits to immigration for national security, but there's also national security threats. Like there's a national security lens on the immigration front.
Sure.
But the global influence piece was more, if you were to say, okay, if you just think, forget immigration right now, like we're just talking about, countries, developed, advanced economies like Canada are all facing the same thing. We're seeing demographic decline, aging populations, fewer children. What are the interventions to address that? What can a country do? A country can either focus on natural growth, which we know from, lots of research that, even with progressive incentives, it's not going to push up the fertility rate too much. So then it's immigration, and it's AI and technology. To what extent can we use, AI and technology? If you don't do any interventions, then you just basically have, if you're just put it bluntly, people aging, dying out, and the country becoming smaller, smaller, and to the point where as, conflicts continue to develop around the world and natural resources continue to decline, smaller countries with smaller populations are not in position to defend their interests, period. So
Right.
we just need to think about, global partnerships and national security are one plank of a national framework for growth. And so sort of if I was talking to government right now, I'd be saying, don't just think about immigration on its own. Think about it as part of a national smart growth framework. And Century Initiative just put out a paper this week that articulated what those principles are, what some common goals are, drawing on international best practices. And we intend to do more work in the coming year around it.
The only fair challenge back, I think, if you're thinking of global influence, global influence being driven by GDP size, and then we don't care about the distributional consequences or GDP per capita so much on that pure lens of things. And you do get into some trouble then, because you then go, okay, well, we're going to bring in a lot of people in order to drive our overall GDP growth, 100 million people by 2100. And but if you don't think of those distributional consequences and how the pre-existing population is benefiting or not, as it relates to that growth, then you do get into some messy politics and some distributional unfairness. And so it does track. Like, I think there is a fair challenge back to say, well, hang on, global influence, sure, and growing GDP, but considering GDP per capita on that front, considering the distributional consequences to the pre-existing population does, and the wellness impacts to the pre-existing population does matter a great deal too, if you care about sustainability and fairness.
100%.
I guess the last question I have for you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, like, I didn't say that didn't matter. The whole framework.
Yeah, I know exactly. Yeah, but because you're not saying that's your only metric.
Right. And we have a productivity challenge. It's not going to be solved through immigration. We have to deal with the productivity challenge that we have to grow GDP.
Yeah, exactly.
And GDP per capita.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's a plank of the pillar of growth, right? Immigration being one, economic being another, regional development another, and global partnerships and national security being another. And so what we're saying is
my last question, which was also a question I asked the professor. So I'm definitely in the minority in politics here, because I think regularization can be sold to the Canadian public, so long as it's a broad-based program like we saw under Pierre Trudeau 50 years ago, where it's you're here for 5+ years, you're not a recent asylum seeker, and you're not, circumventing our actual processes and rules.
Right.
You're not someone who's been here for only a year or two. People have been here for 5+ years who are economic contributors to their neighborhoods and their communities. In some cases, they are, they can't access, in many cases, they can't access social services and healthcare services that they deserve. But more than that, in some cases, they're not contributing tax dollars that they, despite working here for a number of years. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to ever be deported. They're undocumented and just working, in some cases, under the table, as I say. It seems obvious to me that we should normalize that situation, regularize that, in conjunction with other measures that we're taking. I'm told that it's bad politics. What do you think about it?
Well, I think it doesn't matter. I mean, right now you can't sell that, and I wouldn't even bother even talking about it because, you can't. Canadians.
It's fair. It's the right thing to do, but politics is so stupid we can't do it.
Well, I think it's a good point to make right now, because if Trump gets in, we might see more people coming across the border to Canada. So, and who knows how things are gonna evolve, and so I think the question is still there. I think that I think what I've said, I've been on record saying on that point that obviously we have to have there's security has to be considered because we have national security challenges.
Yeah, of course, yeah, and that's always part of the package. Yeah,
that's always part of it. I think we also can't create a system that incentivizes people to kind of go through the back door and get in. So I just think
exactly. Yeah, that's why you have the 5-year marker. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
right. And just like with anything, you have to have a plan, and it needs to be responsible, and you need to bring Canadians along. So to get to your answer, if to do what you want to do, you have to bring Canadians along and have a plan and show them how it's going to benefit them.
We are very far away from that. If we are slashing permanent levels, we are very far away from that, unfortunately. And it does speak to this, I think the fraught conversation around immigration, how it gets weaponized in some quarters. And thankfully, I've been able to have a thoughtful conversation with Professor Skuterud and with yourself, despite some disagreements. There's actually overwhelmingly a lot in common. And I hope that is the takeaway from listeners, that you've got two people who come at this, in some cases, in a really contested way, but they agree that temporary immigration should have been curtailed. They agree that permanent levels, we've overcorrected, and they agree that we need stability on a going forward basis, so that there's some certainty to and planning to the immigration system. And I think there's more of a contest on terms of what the goals should be. But again, on the nuts and bolts of it, where there's actually a lot of similarities. So Lisa, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for being an advocate for a lot of different things, but for your work on affordable housing in particular.
Thank you so much. I would just say that the one piece that I want listeners to take away is we need a multi-year plan for growth to inform immigration. So thank you so much for allowing me to have a voice on that, and I appreciate being here.
Yes, it's a good parting thought, and I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Uncommons. I hope you enjoy this deeper dive. I hope you listen to both of the deeper dives on the Canadian immigration system. As always, if you have suggestions for future guests or topics, sometimes they can be high-profile guests. Sometimes it's nice to do a deeper and wonkier dive on different policy areas, especially when there is subject to such important debate as immigration policy is. You can send me a note at info@beyn8.ca if you have ideas. Please do leave us a positive review on your platform of choice if you like what we're doing. And otherwise, until next time.